I think we should perhaps start, and I have the pleasure of introducing myself this morning. So I'm Barry Eichengreen from the University of California at Berkeley. I notice, looking around, that the average age in this room is below the average age of the conference as a whole. So I take that as a good sign, and maybe an indication that some of my work gets assigned in university courses here. So that may account in part for the demographics of this particular audience. I should also say thank you to the Gaidar Institute's press, which is bringing out a version of my book, Hall of Mirrors, which is going to be the topic of my talk this morning. The book is scheduled to appear very, very soon, so we were hopeful that there would be actual physical copies for me to hold in my hand this morning, but that is not the case. We'll have to wait a few more weeks for the book to appear. So my plan then is to proceed as follows: to talk for about 30 minutes or so and give you the basic argument of the book, trying to relate it to some of the current problems of the global economy. And then we will have 10 or 15 minutes, if all goes according to plan, for questions and answers. So you have been warned the question and answer part will follow shortly. The full title of the book is Hall of Mirrors: The Great Depression, the Great Recession, and the Uses and Misuses of History. So the argument of the book is fundamentally about the role of history in policymaking, economic policymaking in particular. I argue, I make an argument that I think will be very familiar to people in Russia. It certainly applies here, that history is a lens through which we, by which I mean both the public and our elected and appointed officials, view current problems, and that the logic of historical argument, the logic of historical analogy, is never more powerful, never more compelling than during crises. Crises, after all, are when there's no time for careful analytical reasoning. Crises are when there is no time for formal model building and the statistical testing of models of a sort that economists are trained to engage in. So during crises, policymakers resort to analogical reasoning. They reason by way of analogy with similar events, similar crises in the past. So this is a point that specialists on foreign policy have long made. They point to the powerful influence of the Munich analogy, Munich in 1938, in US President Harry Truman's decision to intervene in Korea, for example. They point to a variety of similar episodes where past Cold War tensions informed the US decision to intervene in Vietnam in the 1960s. So it is as well with economic policy in crises. So it was in particular with the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and the Great Recession and the Great Depression of 1920, 1933, the two great economic crises of the past century. I think there is absolutely no doubt that that conventional wisdom about that earlier episode, what are referred to by scholars as the lessons of the Great Depression, powerfully shaped the economic policy response to the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. In particular, the decisions of policymakers this time were powerfully shaped by received wisdom about the mistakes of their predecessors. In the 1930s, when that earlier crisis hit, those predecessors resorted to protectionism. They cut public spending at the worst possible time. They failed to stabilize the money supply. They failed to provide emergency liquidity to the banks. The result being collapsing banks, collapsing prices, collapsing trade, collapsing economic activity, in a phrase, the great macroeconomic catastrophe of modern times. This story about the 1930s, that the earlier economic crisis reflected disastrous but entirely avoidable policy failures, became conventional wisdom, courtesy of influential analyses like Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's Monetary History of the United States. That was the book that Ben Bernanke had studied so closely in his years as a scholar. It was the book that Bernanke metaphorically kept beside his bed during the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Friedman and Schwartz had devoted a short 120-page chapter to what they called the Great Contraction of 1929, 1933. So having studied that history, having learned the lessons of the Great Depression, policymakers this time vowed to do better. If the failure of their predecessors to provide emergency liquidity had resulted in a catastrophic banking and financial crisis, then this time, instead, they would flood financial markets with liquidity. If their failure to stabilize the money supply in the 1930s had resulted in a disastrous deflation, this time instead they would cut interest rates to zero and expand central bank balance sheets. If efforts to balance budgets had worsened the earlier slump, then this time instead they would apply fiscal stimulus. And as a result of this very different response, unemployment in my country, unemployment in the United States peaked in 2010 at only, I should wiggle my fingers to denote quotation marks, at only 10%. So 10% was unacceptable. 10% was painfully high, but it was still far below the catastrophic 25% unemployment that we suffered through in the United States in the 1930s. Failed banks, this time, numbered in the hundreds, not in the thousands, as in the 1930s. Financial dislocations this time were widespread, but the complete and utter collapse of financial markets, as happened in the 1930s, was successfully avoided. And what was true of the United States was true to varying degrees of other countries. So quoting, I paraphrase a well-known Russian author in the book to the effect that every unhappy country is happy in its own way, and there were varying degrees of economic unhappiness starting in 2008. But a few ill-starred European countries notwithstanding, that unhappiness did not rise to 1930s levels because policy was better this time. The decline in output and employment, the social dislocations, the human pain and suffering this time were all less. That then is the happy narrative, and I want to suggest, I argue in the book, that this happy narrative is in fact a bit too happy. It's a bit too easy on contemporary policymakers. For one thing, it's hard to square with the failure of those same policymakers and the failure of economists more generally to anticipate the risks. Queen Elizabeth II famously posed this question to the assembled economists on visiting the London School of Economics in 2008. She asked the economists, why did no one see it coming? A good question. To be sure, the Queen later, the economists later wrote the Queen a letter, and some of them claimed that they had in fact seen it coming. But I think if you look at what they wrote, they were actually warning of other crises that did not, in fact, occur, like a dollar crash or something like that, or else they were simply issuing the kind of vague, non-specific warnings that economists are prone to issuing. That even specialists on financial crises didn't sound louder warnings suggests adopting a somewhat less critical posture to officials in the 1920s for failing to anticipate and head off their crisis. So that's my own mea culpa as well. I'm a specialist on financial crises. I'm supposed to be a specialist on the history of financial crises, and I didn't exactly see it coming. One modestly good thing about the crisis is it's forced professional economists to engage in some soul searching and try to understand better why we failed to see it coming. Introspection suggests to me that our failure reflects what psychologists refer to as continuity bias, the subconscious tendency to think that the future will resemble the immediate past. It reflects peer pressure to conform and the costs of being ostracized. If you were so reckless as to criticize Alan Greenspan's good financial stewardship, as one economist did at the Federal Reserve's Jackson Hole conference in 2005, he was never invited back. It reflects the power of a dominant ideology, in this case, the ideology of efficient markets, and it reflects the influence of big financial institutions, notably through their political contributions in countries like mine, the United States. Ultimately, though, I would argue that the roots of our failure to see the recent crisis coming lay in the same progressive narrative of the Great Depression that I described earlier. So recall that narrative. It goes like this. Entirely correctable flaws of collective decision-making had been responsible for the inability of contemporaries to appreciate the risks to stability in the 1920s, and then for their failure to effectively deal with the consequences in the 1930s. Modern-day policymakers had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. That was the narrative. Scientific central banking, informed by a rigorous framework that we called inflation targeting, had reduced economic and financial volatility. Advances in supervision and regulation had contained the most serious risks to financial stability. Deposit insurance was put in place in countries like mine in the 1930s in response to the banking panics and bank runs of that period, and had eliminated the danger of more banking panics and bank runs of that sort. So went the conventional narrative. Conventional wisdom about the Great Depression, that it was caused by entirely avoidable policy failures, was itself conducive to the belief that those failures could be, and indeed had been, corrected, so it followed that no comparable crisis was possible now. All of which we appreciate with hindsight was dreadfully wrong. Part of the problem, I think, is that we, here I mean we economic historians, this being my second mea culpa, had always done a better job of explaining the course of the Great Depression, why it became so great in the West, why it became so serious once it was underway, those avoidable policy mistakes, than we had been at explaining the onset of the crisis. Here I'm going to give you a series of observations about the 1920s, but wherever I say the 1920s, you should feel free to substitute the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, because I think all the same arguments apply. We had failed to highlight how, in the 1920s, rapid financial innovation had combined with inadequate regulation and loose monetary policy to create dangerous financial imbalances and fragilities. We had failed to explain how capital flows to one half of Europe from the other half of Europe and the rest of the world had set that continent up for a painful fall. We had failed to explain how, in the 1920s, the naive belief that advances in scientific central banking had rendered crises a thing of the past led contemporaries to disregard the risks to stability. We had failed to explain how, in the 1920s, a long period of stability, they called it the new era, where we called it the Great Moderation, encouraged risk-taking and empowered those who argued against stricter financial regulation. Recent experience suggests the need to write this history of the 1920s more carefully. I think if we had done so, we might have seen more clearly how many of the same factors were at work in the early 21st century. The fateful decision to let the investment bank Lehman Brothers fail in September of 2008, the single biggest mistake of the financial crisis, in my view, also suggests looking at the history of the 1920s differently. So to start with Lehman, in 2008, Lehman failed because it was insolvent, because its managers had made bad banks. Lehman also failed because there were doubts about whether the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury had the legal authority or power to rescue it. That's the argument that Ben Bernanke makes in his new book, that the Fed and the Treasury lacked the legal authority. But I think it's clear that another reason Lehman was allowed to fail was that policymakers wanted to make a statement. They had bailed out another big investment bank 6 months earlier, Bear Stearns, and they had experienced a firestorm of criticism from the media, from the Congress, etc., for having bailed out a first set of bad bankers, and they wanted to make another statement to the effect that not all bad bankers would be bailed out. I think as a result of our having now lived through that experience, we, future historians, will write the history of the Great Depression differently. We will write the history of the 1930s differently. So this is kind of an example of the argument I make in the book, that history from 80 years ago shapes and informs how we think about our crisis. But conversely, our crisis also changes how we think about that earlier history that occurred 80 years earlier. I think having lived through the Lehman Brothers experience, we will be reminded that the banking crises of the 1930s reflected not only the fact that central banks and governments didn't adequately appreciate the importance of their acting as lenders of last resort, but also, exactly as in the case of Lehman Brothers, the concern of those policymakers with moral hazard and their wish to push back against the political criticism to which they were being subjected very much shaped how they responded to that earlier crisis. So let me give you a single illustrative example. The greatest banking crisis of the 1930s was in the United States in 1933, and it was caused by the failure of the government, a US government agency named the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, to rescue the Guardian Group of banks in the state of Michigan. So the Guardian Group, a big Michigan group of banks, failed. The governor of the state of Michigan had to close down the state's entire banking system. That undermined confidence and the solvency of banks in neighboring states. Other governors had to do the same. The incoming president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then had to close down the entire US banking and financial system for 2 weeks as his first act upon assuming office. So you can see why the Great Depression became great. An economy doesn't function without a banking and financial system, and the US didn't have one for March of 1933. So why did the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, in its wisdom, allow the Guardian Group to fail? The Guardian Group was Henry Ford's family bank. It was the bank of the big automotive industrialist, also headquartered in Michigan. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation had bailed out another big bank 6 months earlier. The Central Republic Trust in the state of Illinois. Central Republic Trust was known as the Dawes Bank, spelled D-A-W-E-S, the family bank of Charles Dawes, former U.S. Vice President, and until 1 week before the bailout, head of the same government agency, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So you can imagine the congressional criticism of the friendly government bailout of the Dawes Bank that occurred in mid-1932, and the wish of the government not to allow itself to be subjected to the same criticism again 6 months later. So having bailed out Central Republic Trust in 1932, they let the Guardian Group fail in 1933, resulting in the greatest banking crisis of the 1930s, directly in parallel with bailing out Bear Stearns in March of 2008, but letting Lehman Brothers fail 6 months later. I think another disastrous error in 2008 was the failure to anticipate how disruptive allowing the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers would be. And here too, I would blame the so-called lessons of the Great Depression. The conventional narrative about the Great Depression given us by Friedman and Schwartz in their monetary history focused on the disruptive impact of bank failures, commercial bank failures, and runs on banks by households, retail depositors, in other words. Lehman Brothers didn't have retail depositors. Lehman Brothers was an investment bank, not a deposit-taking bank. Therefore, the conclusion followed. Lehman's failure, if you took that conventional wisdom literally, Lehman's failure wouldn't be particularly disruptive. I think this view, informed by those same lessons of the Great Depression, was why the Basel Capital Accord, setting capital standards for financial institutions, focused on commercial banks. Deposit insurance in the US and elsewhere focused on commercial banks. Regulation generally focused on commercial banks. That focus, of course, neglected where the biggest problem was. The biggest problem was in the shadow banking system of investment banks, hedge funds, money market funds, commercial paper issuers. That focus ignored the fact that Lehman Brothers had very large positions in derivative instruments. It ignored the fact that other banks could run on Lehman. So the result was of that conventional focus or conventional wisdom was the decision on September 15th, 2008 to allow the uncontrolled failure of Lehman Brothers, as I said before, the single most serious mistake of the financial crisis. So it was at this point, the next morning, September 16th, 2008, that policymakers finally fully understood that they had a situation on their hands, that we really were on the verge of another Great Depression. So the leaders of the advanced industrial countries quickly issued their joint statement that no more systemically significant financial institutions would be allowed to fail. The US Congress passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Finally, one after another, governments took steps to recapitalize their banks, provide emergency liquidity to financial markets, unroll massive programs of fiscal stimulus. Policymakers responded forcefully and they congratulated themselves that they had successfully avoided another Great Depression. I think the paradox here, though, is that the results of these policymakers were less than we had been promised. Post-crisis recovery in the United States has been disappointing. It's been lethargic, as everyone here knows. It has proceeded at only about half the rate of a normal economic recovery. Europe has done even worse, experiencing a double dip recession, growth at only half the rate of growth in the US, and a crisis that has been ongoing for the last 5 years. So this was not the successful stabilization and the vigorous recovery that we had been promised by those who had learned the lessons of history. I think the explanation for this disappointment is straightforward. I argue in the book that recovery has been disappointing because policymakers failed to do more. They failed to adequately substitute public spending for private spending when private spending was collapsing. They failed to use monetary policy sufficiently aggressively. So I understand that in arguing, as I do in the book, that we should have had larger budget deficits and more monetary stimulus in response to the crisis. I'm pushing back against conventional wisdom. I'm pushing back against conventional wisdom in Europe. I'm pushing back against the conventional wisdom of all the candidates running for the presidency on the Republican side in the United States. So let me push a little bit in the book. I first look at the fiscal and monetary stimulus of 2009, and I show that there is strong evidence, model-based evidence, quantitative evidence, qualitative evidence, that these measures helped to stabilize the economy, but they were too small. They were underpowered relative to the scale of the problem. I then look at the effects of fiscal consolidation, fiscal contraction, starting in 2010. And again, there is strong evidence, I think I successfully show there, that Europe's double-dip recession and the US economy's failure to grow faster were both associated with this contractionary shift. Similarly with monetary policy, recall, as I developed at some length in the book, about how the European Central Bank concluded that its work was done already in 2010. It started phasing out its unconventional policies, and it raised interest rates already in 2011, not once, but twice. It took the Fed until September of 2012, until QE3 in September of 2012, to make an open-ended commitment to keep purchasing securities until the risk of deflation was finally off the table. And even now in the United States, when the Fed is beginning to raise interest rates, we continue to undershoot our 2% inflation target. So there is a large literature now in the field on what economists call secular stagnation, by which we mean, or I mean at least, slow growth due to deficient spending, mainly deficient investment spending. Secular stagnation is a complex question. The roots of the problem are complicated. It may reflect the lingering effects of the crisis, the debt overhang that takes time for the countries of the West to work down. It may reflect the fact that new activities in information technology, in particular, are not as capital intensive. They don't require as much physical investment as older industries. The phenomenon may reflect the fact that the relative price of investment goods has been trending downward for 30 years. So we don't have to spend as much on investment to increase capacity to the same extent as we had to spend in the past. But I think if the problem is complicated, the solution is still simple. The solution is more public spending on infrastructure, for example, thereby capitalizing on current unprecedentedly low interest rates, more public spending on infrastructure to substitute for the missing private spending. And I think our failure in the West to undertake it explains why the recovery from this crisis has been so weak. What lessons, historical or otherwise, informed these decisions underlying the failure to do more? For central banks, there was, as there always is for central banks, deeply ingrained fear of inflation. That fear was nowhere more powerful than in Germany, which had suffered through 2 hyperinflations in the 20th century, and German fears now dictated European central bank policy, given the German Bundesbank-like structure of the ECB. I think the United States is a more complicated case because the US had not experienced hyperinflation any time in the 20th century or any time in its history for that matter. But that didn't prevent overwrought commentators from warning that a hyperinflationary German-style outcome was right around the corner. I'm convinced that sophisticated central bankers like Chairman Bernanke and his colleagues knew better, but there's still no doubt that they were influenced by the criticism. The more hysterical the commentary about hyperinflation just around the corner became, the more loudly the Congress accused the Fed of debasing the dollar, the more Federal Reserve governors then feared for the independence of their institution, and that rendered them anxious to start shrinking the Fed's balance sheet toward normal levels before there was anything resembling a normal economy. So if you ask me, why did the Fed decide to begin raising interest rates in December of 2015? There were arguments about how the US economy was doing better. There were arguments about potential financial imbalances associated with zero interest rates. But fundamentally, I think there was political criticism that the Fed was doing reckless things and inflation was right around the corner, and that ultimately was what tipped the balance for Chair Yellen and her colleagues. In the case of fiscal policy, the case for continued stimulus or more fiscal stimulus was weakened by its failure to deliver everything promised, whether because politicians are always prone to overpromising or because the economy was actually contracting even more rapidly in 2009 than anyone knew when the initial stimulus was designed. There was the failure to distinguish how bad conditions were from how much worse they would have been without the policy. There was the failure to distinguish the need for fiscal consolidation in the medium term and the long term from the need for more public spending in the short run. There was the failure to distinguish the case for fiscal consolidation in countries that clearly needed it, like Greece, from the situation of countries with space to do more in terms of public spending, like the United States and Germany. So I write in the book, a range of factors came together. The one thing they had in common was failure. Inevitably, failures like these, economic policy failures like these, have multiple causes. There was the dominance of ideology in politics over what I would regard as sensible economics. There was the failure of we economists to more effectively make the case for better policies. So there's my third mea culpa. I think we should have been doing more, professional economists as public intellectuals. There was the tendency for economists to forget as many lessons of the 1930s as they remembered. But I think the most powerful factor in this premature decision to abandon policies that would have done more to support the economy when the economy still needed support was the simple fact that policymakers had prevented the worst. They had successfully avoided another Great Depression. They could declare the emergency over. So they could heed the call for an early return to normal policies. The irony, I think, is that their very success in preventing another 1930s-like economic collapse led to their failure to support a more vigorous recovery. So the way I put it on the last page of the book is that success became the mother of failure. So people talk about many of the unintended consequences or side effects of how we responded to the great crisis of 2008, 2009. I point into the book to another unintended consequence or side effect, which is this unwillingness to do more to support economic growth when it is within our capacity to do just that. So this is a case where, ironically, success was the mother of failure. Talking about a 400-page book in 30 minutes is a very peculiar experience for an author. There's a lot more, there's more subtlety in the book than there can be subtlety in a 30-minute summary thereof. But that's the core argument, and I'm happy to hear questions about it, take some questions about these issues from the audience. So thank you very much. Hold your hands up if you have a query, and I'm happy to recognize you.
Thank you so much for your speech, and it was really, really interesting.
I think the translator wants you to.
Thank you so much for your speech. It was extremely interesting. I've got probably a really general question. So knowing causes and consequences of all the downturns that you've mentioned in your book, so is it possible to compare all this to what's going on in the world nowadays? Sorry, if it is rather tricky.
Well, so the question was, would it be accurate to paraphrase your question as asking, is it possible to use this kind of economic history for forecasting purposes?
Because this is our future history.
Economists are not good forecasters. As you well know, Paul Samuelson, the eminent MIT economist, had a line about how economists have successfully forecast 11 out of the last 7 crises or recessions. So I think that, I'm firmly convinced that economic history is useful for understanding our world, not only for understanding how we got here, but also for understanding where we might be going next. But history has to be used very carefully when people are trying to project the future. It has to be used very sensitively in that context. Let me give you an example. So one way in which the crisis of the 1930s ended, one way in which the crisis of the 1930s was resolved, was by abandoning the international monetary regime of that period, the gold standard. The gold standard prevented central banks from cutting interest rates. It prevented them from depreciating their currencies where they had to. It prevented governments from running budget deficits and replacing private spending, which was disappearing, with public spending. The gold standard was abandoned. Governments turned to those policies. Economies recovered. People use that history to think about Europe and the Eurozone today. So the euro functions a lot today like the gold standard did in the 1930s. People look back at that earlier history and say, won't the euro crisis be resolved by European countries abandoning the euro in exactly the same way that they abandoned the gold standard? Well, I think there are parallels, but there are also important differences that getting out of the gold standard when you still had the dollar or the French franc or the British pound sterling was easier than getting out of the euro when Greece no longer has the drachma, when Germany no longer has the Deutschmark. European countries have built collective institutions, the European Commission, the European Court of Justice, the European Parliament, and importantly, the European Central Bank, to provide central management of their system, at least to a degree, more central management than the gold standard possessed in the 1930s. So I think in thinking about the lessons of history for forecasting purposes, you've got to think about the differences as well as the parallels. I think about those differences and I conclude that the euro will not go the way of the gold standard. The euro is likely here to stay because of those differences. European countries will have to suffer with its consequences, or to put it in a more optimistic way, they will have to figure out how to make it work.
Thank you so much.
Я Татьяна Илларионова, я работаю.
I'm Tatiana Ilarionova. I work for RANEPA. In 2016, according to the Russian government, administrative load on the Russian business is going to grow. There will be more reporting. There will be more other things. Reports would have to be provided on a quarterly basis. Do you think this is a reasonable decision from standpoint of public administration at the time of crisis? And another thing, shortly you are going to participate in a plenary panel together with the Prime Minister. What are you going to suggest to the Russian government to do in the current situation in today's Russian economy?
For me, who will the kind person be? I don't have the earphone that would be necessary to hear the gentleman. Okay.
You would have to ask the lady to repeat the question. This is the English channel. This is the English channel. This is the English channel. You would have to ask the lady to repeat the question, please.
Very briefly.
In 2016, Russia is going to see a serious increase in the load on the businesses. That has to do with the administrative requirements. There will be more reporting requirements for the pension fund. In the past, businesses had to submit reports quarterly. Now they're going to do that on a monthly basis. Tax authorities are also going to require more reports on a quarterly basis. Do you think this makes sense at the time of a crisis? Also, shortly, you're going to participate in the panel with Dmitry Medvedev, our Prime Minister. Based on your experience, what could you recommend to the Prime Minister at the current crisis situation? Thank you.
So, difficult questions both. Certainly the second one is difficult. I think the outlook in 2016 for the world economy is quite troubling. People are worried about slow growth in China. They're worried about slow growth in emerging markets. They're worried about low oil prices. I worry a little bit about those things, but I worry even more about the potential for slow growth in the US and Europe, and about the fact that there is no policy space left for central banks and governments to respond to a slowdown in the US and Europe. So I put all that together, and I think I would tell the Prime Minister, do not bet on an improving external environment. To the contrary, the external environment facing Russia could get worse before it gets better, and prepare for that. And I would stop with that vague advice for the Prime Minister. On the issue of reporting requirements, I'm a firm believer in the importance of reporting transparency for strong corporate governance. If you believe in markets, markets need information in order to make sensible decisions and provide the market discipline that managers, CEOs, boards of directors should be subject to if they're going to make sensible decisions. You put that question in an especially interesting way. You ask whether the current crisis, the current difficult situation, is the right time to move ahead with increased reporting requirements and standards and so forth. It's never a comfortable time to move ahead with that. So I think now is as good a time as ever to move ahead with those costly, painful, difficult, but necessary changes. I'm sure there is a long Russian economy-related backstory to that question about which I'm not familiar. One more before we conclude.
First of all, thank you for your speech. And secondly, my question is, as I understood from your argument, the decision on rescuing or non-rescuing the Lehman Brothers is much of a battle between policy interests and economic interests. So the question is there a way to avoid this conflict? Thank you.
I think having lived through my own crisis in 2008, 2009, I'm more sensitive than I was before to the fact that political arguments often triumph over economic arguments, that we economists spend a lot of time thinking about what the right model is and weighing the costs and benefits of different measures, but it's ultimately political arguments and political self-interest in economies like the US, which I study, that carry the day. That has changed the way I think about the history of the 1920s, where that history is often written as failures of economic reasoning, where economic reasoning was better than many people, many historians have acknowledged, but politics got in the way then as now. So having lived through it myself, I'm more sensitive to the fact. What can we do about it was your question. And I think proper institutional design can go some small way in limiting the distorting influence of politics. So that's why I believe that independent central banks are better than non-independent central banks, and why countries that have independent fiscal councils, groups of experts that are basically watchdogs that issue independent reports on fiscal policy and whether it's being appropriately conducted or not, are better off than countries that don't. Will that eliminate the influence of politics? Obviously it will not, but it may minimize it may limit the distorting effects. So I think one of the things we need to do as economists and political scientists, I wear the hat of a political scientist sometimes as well, is to think about optimal institutional design to limit the ability of politics to distort economic decision-making and economic outcomes. So we've gone over a little bit. Thank you for your patience, and I hope this appears soon. Thank you.